In the second video for this week, I will draw a great deal on a man named Rainier Alberts and on the work of Blenkinsop, Joseph Blenkinsop out of Notre Dame University, and of my former colleague and still dear friend, Richard Weiss, who is not only an extremely respected text critic and Jeremiah scholar, he is also respected in the area of sociology of ancient Judah. So let's look at how Babylonian Judah became Persian Yehud. We tend to think about the exile that Babylon takes everybody captive, moves them up to Mesopotamia, and then with the return of 538, everybody goes home again. But that's not the way it was. In fact, only about 5% went up to Persia, were taken into captivity. Only the elite, the royals, the ones who weren't killed, the crown princes, of course, and the princes of Zedekiah were killed. But otherwise, the royals, the priests of the upper class priests, the upper echelons, the aristocrats, the government administrators, and some of the artisans, and Ezekiel, of course, was one of those. He was a priest. So just about 5% at most were taken into exile, and only a minority of them chose to return. After all, 50 years had passed, which meant that the ones who had gone as adults into exile were, for the most part, had died, and their kids had been born, before they died, of course. Their kids were born and raised in Babylon and presented with the offer to leave the empire, the very cosmopolitan areas, and go to that backwater of Yehud, which was still somewhat suffering from the conquest, still somewhat destroyed. Why would one? So just a few of them went back, and the ones who did go back, they encountered a land that was not empty. The majority of the people who had lived in Judah continued to live in Judah. Now there's some caveats. Some fled into Egypt. Some were killed, of course, in the siege and in the inevitable plagues that would have followed the siege, and of starvation because the Babylonians had burnt the fields and destroyed the infrastructure. But nonetheless, over time, they would have consolidated themselves, the people living in Judah. And in the same way that when the Sandinistas returned after the Somozans returned after the end of the Sandinistas, there's a conflict. You see that also with the Jews and the Palestinians. A Palestinian will say, that land you're sitting on, that's my grandfather's. My grandfather owned that land. And the Jew will say, funny, so did mine. There are multiple competing claims to the same land, then as now. After the Babylonian conquest, especially after 586, but even after 597, there is never again a coherent, unified Judah. From now on, Judahites are in 3 different areas. They're in Egypt. There's colonies where people fled to Egypt to avoid being under Babylonian rule. There are still people in Judah, and there are people settled in Mesopotamia. We'll look at those colonies one by one. The Jews in Babylon were, for the most part, really well integrated into Babylonian society by the time Persia came into power. We don't have evidence from 539, but we have evidence from shortly thereafter, about 100 years into the exile, so about 480s, some tablets that were the records of payment for a factory in the day. And it is the case that the people with Babylonian names and the people with Hebrew names, there's no distinction in how much they're paid. They seem to be well integrated. Moreover, most of them therefore chose to stay. I mean, we're talking about a cosmopolitan center of the empire versus a backwater that the people invited to return had never visited. It's sort of like the dreamers today. Why would they want to go back to the land their parents escaped from? Most chose to stay in Babylon. And those who returned, they returned because the government had told them to, the royal appointees, or they were priests whose center really was Jerusalem, or they were religiously motivated. And by the way, until about the year 2000, well, no, till about the early 20th century, one of the largest Jewish communities in the world was in Iraq and Iran. Mesopotamian Jews had a thriving colony, and that's where the Talmud was the Talmud was organized there, the Babylonian Talmud at least. And it was really a thriving intellectual center for Judaism for centuries. And I think I said in one of the previous PowerPoints, the last Jew left Iraq, who was a descendant of these exiled families. Last Jewish descendant left Iraq in the year 2000. We need to remember that history because for a long time, Jews and Muslims got along fairly well, thank you. And that means they can do it again. Okay, the Jews in Egypt, our evidence is from the 5th century, not the 6th. They formed colonies, some of which were military colonies. They had their own temples. They were in touch with Jerusalemites. There's letters that have been found that went back and forth. And by the way, both Babylon and Egypt had women had higher status in those places. And so in the colonies in Egypt, we have the papyri from a colony called Elephantine. Elephantine had mixed cultures, but it had a thriving Jewish culture with community with a Jewish temple. And the women could initiate divorce, the Jewish women. The women could own property. The women could be witnesses legally. And the women paid exactly the same temple tax as the men, which is in contrast to what Leviticus puts forth. Okay, that's Egypt. What about Jerusalem and Judah? Well, in the early days after the conquest, archaeologists have found burn layers of all the major cities of the south, not the north, but the south. And that includes, of course, Jerusalem. And the fields were destroyed, the infrastructure was destroyed. By 586, the temple had been destroyed, and it was a site of widespread famine and disease, both because of lack of infrastructure and because of, well, there was a military battle and a lot of people died, and there were too many corpses to bury immediately. And of course there was disease. That's been the case throughout history. War leads to famine and disease, to the plague. And you can read all about it in Lamentations, that the little ones faint and their life is poured out on their mother's bosom because there's nothing to eat. There's a radical decrease in population, not only because of the 5% who were exiled, but also because of the deaths and also because of the people who fled to Egypt, but also because half of the territory is lost. I'll get to that in a moment. So instead of 7,500 in Jerusalem, which had swelled when the north fell to Assyria with the refugees, but after Babylonian conquest, the best estimates by Charles Carter is that Jerusalem of Judah had about 1,000 people in it. That's just a seventh, less than a seventh of what it had. Moreover, neighboring nations, particularly Edom, seized Judah's land. Before the Babylonian conquest, Yehud, Judah, had all this all the way down into the deep Negev, southern land. And the Babylonians gave permission to the Edomites to come up and swallow up half of Judah, which, by the way, is why there's a certain hatred of the Edomites in, say, Psalm 137 and some of the other texts. After Babylon allowed the Edomites to take over the southern half, Judah is this little square about 25 miles from one edge to the other. You could really put it inside the greater Twin Cities area and have room left over. So, by the way, the Idumeans and the Idumeans, those are the people who were in the south who are taken over by Edom. So when you read in the New Testament about the Idumeans, that's who they are. They're sort of identify themselves with the Jews, but they aren't accepted, just like the Samaritans. Over time, however, in the 70 years, 50 years, 70 years after the conquest, over time, those left behind would have taken over the abandoned and burnt fields and would have cultivated them and grown crops. And they would have filled the empty leadership positions with new leaders. Remember, there's a new generation here. And over time, they begin to heal from the war. And so, when the elite come back from exile, they will encounter the land being occupied by others that their parents or grandparents had had, the jobs that their parents and grandparents had held by others, and there's a lot of tension. So we'll end our discussion of how Babylonian Judah became Persian period Yehud now, and we will go to the early Persian period Yehud and the struggles that they faced.